Thank you very much, first of all, for accepting our interview. You published a book which is called The Dawn of Eurasia, a very interesting one. To Ukrainians, the term of Eurasia is known starting from the 20th century. From the beginning of the 20th century, it's linked to Trubetskoy and later on to Gumilov and maybe even to Alexander Dugin, a person close to Putin. Could you please explain in which way your understanding of Eurasia is different from this one?
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. I think it's a word with lots of different meanings throughout history. In my case, it means the combination of Europe and Asia. For Russian thinkers, usually it means something in between Europe and Asia, a third continent in between. The purpose in the book is to reconcile Europe and Asia. I think at least for 500 years, they are seen as two different worlds, almost two different planets. I think this is interesting and important for Ukraine because Ukraine is a country on the gates of Europe, as people say. And I think in a world where Europe and Asia are truly reconciled, Ukraine no longer has to feel on the border, on the periphery, can be at the center. So it's a country that I thought about a lot writing the book.
But at the same time, you're describing Asia and Europe, and you are talking about what you call competitive integration. You are writing that this century will not be Asian, it will be European. It's the end of the European monopoly, I would say, in the world. It will not be American, but it will be a kind of coexistence of all these poles of influence, of power. What do you mean by saying that this is a competitive integration? What kind of integration is this?
I think we are becoming more and more integrated. Globalization is not disappearing. I think what is different from the last, let us say, 5 years is that we are realizing that you can be integrated but still be competing. There's still conflict, in some cases war. There's new kinds of war, information war, cyber war. Even refugees are used as a weapon of war. So I think the world we are entering is a world where we all live together, integrated, but there are different blocks competing for power and influence. And I think the war in Ukraine, the Vilnius summit in 2013, for many people in Europe, it was the beginning of an awareness that the world is more dangerous, that competition and conflict are becoming more central.
You are talking a lot about this Vilnius summit, and many Ukrainians do know this event because all started in the modern history of Ukraine, all started back in 2013. We do remember all these days of tension, and when Yanukovych was to sign the agreement, he refused to do so. But I was quite surprised that you talk quite little, even you don't talk at all about Maidan and about the choice of Ukrainian citizens, which changed in a way the history. What is exactly the place of Ukraine in your theory? Because maybe if you talked maybe 25 years ago, you would place maybe Ukraine on the eastern part in Asia with Russia. But today, this association agreement was signed, and Ukraine has chosen its way, its European future. We try to be on the western part. What is your vision?
Yes, I think it was very clear. It was very moving for Europeans, and I remember those days very clearly. The Vilnius summit ended and Maidan started immediately, just a few days after. And for us to see all the European flags in the Maidan was very moving. Lots of people in Europe were commenting that we don't see this kind of European feeling in Europe. And certainly no one in Europe would die for the European flag in the way that those young people here in Maidan died for the European flag. And we saw those European flags covered in blood. And it was very moving for us, a very intense experience, I can say that, for many politicians back then. And the support coming from Europe came out of those feelings. I think it was very clear that Ukraine chose Europe. Also because the model coming from Russia was so unattractive. Perhaps in the future you will be attracted by a model like China, that's entirely possible, but Russia for Ukrainians offers a model that is very unattractive. So the choice was very clearly a choice for Europe back then.
You're talking a lot about Russia and about China. You're talking about these three major players of the continent. You are mentioning European Union, Russia, and China. And what is interesting for us is to see how the relationship between Russia and China are going on, because both states, both countries, we would place them on the side of Asia. But at the same time, it's clear enough that they're quite two different worlds. What should we expect in their relationship for maybe years to come?
I think for the next decade, we're going to see a certain coming together of China and Russia, simply because they both consider their main enemy to be the West. In the future, there's quite a lot of place for rivalry between China and Russia, especially in Central Asia, perhaps even in Ukraine, where China is becoming more influential every year. But for the time being, the feeling in Moscow and Beijing is that the main adversary is Europe and America. And that brings them together. That's also what happened after Ukraine. It was very clear that Russia moved away from Europe. The sanctions was pushing Russia away, and they turned to China to some extent. But of course, China has plans to really have hegemony over Central Asia and even over Russia. So I think in time Russia will realize that China is also a threat. But for the time being, if you talk to people in Moscow, they see the threat coming from the West, not from the East.
At the same time, China is the second world power. I mean, in terms of GDP, for example, it's compared to United States. And we are also following what's happening between the United States and China. A lot of tensions have place now. Do you think that what could be the possible development of this relationship, which is not easy one?
It's going to get worse. I think people in the United States, decision makers, realized finally that China is not becoming more Western, is not converging towards a Western model. It's going in a different direction. And for the past 20 years, there was this illusion that China would first open up economically, then they would open up politically, and by the end, they would be a Western liberal country. Now, no one believes this anymore. And so there is a certain feeling of competition and threat coming from China. Last year, I think, was marked by this. Not only in the United States, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Europe, in Germany, the opinion about China changed. It's now, there's a certain feeling of being threatened by China that didn't exist before. But let me say that for a country like Ukraine, China offers an opportunity to balance Russian power. It's happening in Kazakhstan, it's happening in Georgia. Countries like Kazakhstan and Georgia, they feel a certain danger coming from Russia, and they use China to balance. And eventually, I suspect that Ukraine will also find this an attractive idea. It's a way to block Russian power, to bring in Chinese investment, for example.
What I also find quite surprising in your book is that you are talking about China, and we do understand the real dangers, real challenges, and maybe opportunities of China as a country, as a power. But at the same time, you talk as much about Russia as about China. And if you look at Russia, its GDP now, it's like, it could be compared to GDP of Italy, not the most rich, the richest country in European Union. Do you think that this there's a kind of exaggeration of this alternative model Russia is suggesting, is proposing to, economically speaking, but also socially speaking?
Yes, I get this question a lot, whether I give too much respect to Russia, whether I don't see that Russia is really decaying very fast. I think Russia still has enormous resources, natural resources, the territory, and also the political resources, the strength of the Russian state. You feel it here. It is a political project that has lasted 500 years of increasing state strength and an empire that works and has kept control over all this territory. So I think you should not dismiss Russia. It is a fully modernized country with a highly educated, at least a big part of the population highly educated. I think they have reached a dead end with Putin. With Putin you can no longer expect anything. No reforms, nothing, but just the status quo. But maybe after Putin we will watch a different kind of Russia. And if you take the example of Syria, for example, where clearly they were able to outmaneuver and to outplay the United States, even though their defense budget is a fraction, their GDP is the size of Italy, but still they have this ability to project power, which I think you feel in Ukraine, and now we've seen it in Syria. So it would be a mistake to dismiss or to ignore Russia. When Obama said they are just a regional power, I think this is a mistake. We have to take Russia seriously.
And Russia wants to be taken seriously, that's quite clear. But speaking in terms of the rivalry, a competition of different types of civilizations, because what your book is about 3 or more types of civilization, how you call it, cultures or viewpoints. So if we speak about European civilization based on rules, on principles, on values, and we speak, for example, about Asia, about China, about the different way to see the world, what is quite remarkable about Russia is that in Russian history there were a lot of periods the modern Russia was close to European values. It tried to be close to European values. And now when we observe what's going on now, we as Ukrainians, we see a lot of hypocrisy coming from Russian elites. Because, for example, Russian elite, they do send their children to get Western education, European education. They do keep their money in Western banks. They're trying to play their difference from European model, but at the same time they're profiting from the best that European model can suggest.
Yes, I mean that is really a form of hypocrisy. During the day you attack Europe and then your children are studying there, including Putin's daughter. Now, I wonder, this could change. You know, we are moving now to a world where the West and Europe are much less dominant. And I would not be surprised if in 20 or 30 years Chinese universities are better than European universities. So we have to wait. Let's not be overconfident in the strength of Western culture, because it is being attacked and it is less influential than before. But I do think that Russia is changing, and perhaps for the first time in its history it's turning to the east and moving away from Europe. And I think we continue to see that. Even the Soviet Union was in a way inspired by European political culture, by Marx and Engels. So even during the Cold War, Russia was considered itself as part of Western political culture. What I see now is a real movement away from Europe, deeper than perhaps any time in Russian history. The alternative, of course, is China, and everything depends on whether China will continue to look successful or whether this is not sustainable. If China offers an alternative model, I would not be surprised to see Russia being more and more attracted to China.
And what about India, for example? You're talking not a lot about India in this book, but we know that India is one of the richest countries. The GDP is quite performative. So what do you think about India's future?
I just came back from India, and in some respects you kind of helped me understand why I don't discuss India so much. I think it's early. India is in many respects behind, maybe 20 years behind China, facing problems that are still problems of modernization. So I think it's early, but by the middle of the century, of course, India will be a dominant power. And in some respects, it does have advantages that China doesn't have anymore. Demography, young people, 60% of the people under the age of 25. Perhaps in 20 or 30 years, 1/3 of people living on Earth will be Indian. That's of the demography. So it's inevitable that India will be a dominant power, but it's still quite early. And India has enormous problems. They have not been able to industrialize truly. They have moved from a rural society to a service society. They still lack the manufacturing base. And what we know from human history is that you cannot truly build a modern society with levels of equality and education without a strong manufacturing base. You need that, and that's the Chinese story. So India will have difficulties and problems. We will have to wait maybe 3 decades to see their full potential being realized.
Mm-hmm. There's another country which is of great interest to Ukraine, it's Turkey. Because Turkey is close to Ukraine, and also because Turkey is the point between Europe and Asia, because we followed for many years these attempts of Turkey to be part of the European Union, all these debates which lasted 4 years, and we also followed what happened last year, this coup d'etat which was failed, and I think that they're kind of different, opposite developments in Turkey now. What's your vision of this country at the present moment and in the nearest future?
Yes, I think Turkey is a very interesting case for Ukrainians. I find Turkey and Ukraine in many respects similar, with very high levels of patriotism, for example. Of course, they are the 2 big countries outside the European Union on the European Union's borders. And so they have a lot in common. I think they are moving in different directions in the sense that Ukraine has been moving towards Europe and closer to Europe. And the younger generations in Ukraine are fully committed to Europe. If there are any doubts about European Union membership, they are among older generations. And I feel that in Turkey is a bit the opposite. Turkey has been moving away from Europe, and young people in Turkey have been moving away from Europe. And perhaps if you want to find those people that are fully identified with Europe in Turkey, they are actually sort of the older generations coming from the 60s. So they're moving in different directions, but in many respects similar countries. I think Turkey the last 2-3 years has been having a movement similar to what Russia had, of moving away from Europe and away from the West. And looking towards the East, towards China, in Turkey's case, also working more closely with Iran and with Russia itself. It's a bit disappointing for me, because I think it is fundamental for European security and prosperity to have Turkey and Ukraine as members. That's my opinion. So I'm optimistic about Ukraine, but worried about this movement away from Europe that you see in Turkey.
And maybe my last question about your book and about your viewpoint of all these issues. I've noticed that you are comparing many, for example, European values, and when speaking about Russian content, you are speaking about sovereignty, about different manners to see how the world is, how political system is, and how economic system is. But in your way to tell this story, a reader feels, like a reader like me, feels that there is, you don't defend, I would say, an European model, which is facing extremely important challenges from the outer world. And in a way, maybe you are right, but in a way, maybe Europe and European countries, European model is the best place for people to live. And migration flows show that people, they try to live in the best places. It's all about human rights, all about democracy, etc. Do you think that you can compare, but it's without making a choice for European model today?
I do think Europe is the best place to live, in the sense that it's a place where you feel safe, you can criticize everything and everyone without watching your back. But I have to say that I'm always a bit uncomfortable with Europeans that say this as if it is obvious, without having to make an effort to understand other parts of the world. So I don't quite like those Europeans. Many of them come here and they're just lecturing all the time. And especially I don't like that idea where Europeans regard the rest of the world as being a failed version of Europe. That the rest of the world is trying to become like Europe, but they are not able to. They are like a diminished reflection of Europe. And I don't think that's the best way to look at the world, because China, for example, does not regard itself as a failed version of Europe. They regard themselves as a different civilization. And we have to make an effort, especially people who are thinking and writing, have to make an effort to understand the rest of the world. If I was still a politician, I would be more, let us say, aggressively defending European values. But if I'm a writer in this moment of my life, I think I have to make an intellectual effort to understand the world and not just to be lecturing to everyone else. And in Brussels, I see many people who have lived in that Brussels bubble all their lives. And when they go to other countries, they stay in five-star hotels and they don't talk to anyone. And this is bad. This is not a way to make a better world if you don't even make an effort to understand it.
Thank you very much for an extremely interesting talk.
Thank you, Tatiana.